A tiny black-footed cat was discovered, abandoned and crying in a fierce storm, her fragile form barely surviving the cold. Old man George, a longtime conservationist, was determined to save her, but the odds were stacked against them both. George Hartman had lived a quiet, solitary life for over 3 decades. A wildlife conservationist by trade and passion, he had devoted himself to the care of rare and injured animals. Nestled deep in the forest, his small cabin served as both his home and a sanctuary for those in need of rescue. But in all his years of work, George had never seen a storm quite like the one that rolled through the area that fateful evening. As nightfall approached, George was making his way back from his routine patrol of the nearby wildlife reserve. The wind had picked up, and the skies had darkened rapidly. His heavy boots crunched along the wet ground as the first heavy drops of rain fell. He was about to enter his cabin when he heard something, faint but distinct, a cry. His heart tightened, and his instincts kicked in. He moved toward the sound, peering through the trees, and then he saw her, a tiny, bedraggled black-footed cat, barely visible in the downpour. Her coat was soaked through, and her thin body shivered in the cold. She was crying softly, struggling to move against the force of the storm. Without a second thought, George scooped her up, feeling her frail form pressed against his chest. She was freezing, her tiny body weak and malnourished. George knew that time was running out for her. "Hang on, little one," he whispered as he hurried back to his cabin. This was no ordinary rescue. George could feel it in his bones, this tiny creature had come to him for a reason. George wasted no time, wrapping the tiny black-footed cat in a warm towel as he quickly made his way to his cabin. He placed her gently on the makeshift veterinary table in his small workspace, the flickering light of an oil lamp casting shadows around the room. The storm raged outside, but in the warmth of his cabin, the world felt safe. Yet, George knew that survival wasn't guaranteed. The little cat, whom he decided to name Storm after the tempest that had brought her to him, was barely conscious. Her chest rose and fell weakly, and her coat was matted with rain and dirt. George immediately began the process of warming her, wrapping her in another dry towel and placing a heating pad beneath her. For hours, George sat beside her, monitoring her temperature and checking for signs of life. He spoke softly to her, comforting her with his voice, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. His hands were steady, though his mind was racing. How had she ended up out there, all alone in the storm? And why had she chosen his cabin, out of all places? He stayed with her through the night, occasionally giving her small amounts of water from a dropper, but she remained unresponsive. As dawn broke, George felt a pang of anxiety. This wasn't how he imagined his morning would unfold. The small cat's survival hung by a thread. By the late morning, there was a faint shift in Storm's condition. Her breathing, though shallow, began to stabilize. Her small eyes fluttered open, though they were clouded with exhaustion. George felt a rush of relief. She was alive. But the battle wasn't over yet. Storm had suffered more than just exposure to the storm. From the visible signs of malnutrition, it was clear she had been without proper nourishment for some time. George carefully weighed her in his hands. She was tiny, much smaller than he'd anticipated for a black-footed cat, and her ribs were painfully visible beneath her fur. George knew she needed to eat, but there was no guarantee she would have the strength to swallow anything at first. He had the tools to help, though, a small syringe for feeding liquid nutrition, which he carefully filled and administered to her in tiny doses. It was slow, meticulous work, but George wasn't willing to give up. For the next few days, George dedicated himself entirely to Storm's care. He checked on her constantly, prepared special food and fluids for her, and ensured she was kept warm and comfortable. Despite her fragile state, Storm began to show small signs of improvement. She would curl up near George, trusting him in a way that spoke volumes. But each step forward was fragile. One afternoon, when George was examining her, he noticed something worrying. She had developed a mild fever. He feared the infection that could have been lurking beneath the surface. George knew he had to get her to the vet if she was going to survive. But he hesitated. The storm had caused roads to wash out, and the nearest town was hours away on treacherous terrain. As the fever worsened, George's worry deepened. He knew that without proper care, Storm's chances of survival were rapidly decreasing. She had already been through so much, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing her now. That evening, as the rain stopped and the winds calmed, George made a decision. He couldn't let her die, not like this. His attachment to her, though he tried to keep it at bay, had deepened in a way he hadn't anticipated. George would drive to the town, no matter the cost. "Hold on, Storm," George muttered, taking a deep breath. "We're not giving up." With his jacket zipped tightly around his shoulders and Storm resting carefully in a warm box beside him, George braved the elements once more. The old man and the tiny black-footed cat set out on a journey toward the unknown, fighting for survival every step of the way. The drive to the nearest town was nothing short of harrowing. George maneuvered his aging truck along the muddy, narrow roads with skill born of years of experience, though every jolt and bump sent a wave of concern through him. The box on the passenger seat shifted slightly, and Storm gave a faint, hoarse cry, a sound that twisted George's heart. She was still so small, so fragile, and he couldn't help but fear that every second counted. The roads were nearly impassable, clogged with debris from the storm, but George refused to slow down. He could feel her weakening with every passing hour, and the thought of losing her, after everything, was unbearable. Eventually, they reached the town, and George sped straight to the small veterinary clinic, his truck tires kicking up a cloud of dust as he skidded to a halt. He jumped out and rushed into the clinic, his breath heavy and fast, his worry evident in every movement. Dr. Emily Stone, a veterinarian George had known for years, was already waiting for him, her expression both concerned and calm. She wasted no time as George handed over the small cat, her body now shivering in his arms. Dr. Stone immediately started assessing Storm's condition, checking her vitals and examining the fever that had set in. As she worked, George hovered anxiously, asking questions and offering any details he could about the tiny cat's situation. Dr. Stone was methodical but swift, her focus absolute. George could tell she was doing everything in her power to stabilize the little creature. "Her condition is critical," Dr. Stone finally said, pausing to take a breath. "She's severely underweight, and there's a risk of infection setting in. But if we act fast, we might have a chance. She needs fluids and antibiotics, and we'll have to monitor her temperature closely." George felt a lump rise in his throat. "Do what you have to," he said, his voice rough. "Just don't let her die." Hours passed as Dr. Stone worked tirelessly to stabilize Storm. George, sitting quietly in the corner, couldn't keep his eyes off her. Every time the little cat moved or shifted, George's heart would race. He knew the road ahead would be long, there was no guarantee that Storm would pull through, but he wasn't ready to give up on her. Not after everything she had endured. Finally, as the night wore on, Dr. Stone walked over to George, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "She's hanging in there. It's still touch and go, but her temperature is stabilizing, and she's responding to the antibiotics. She's a fighter." George exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in days, a small spark of hope flickered in his chest. He wasn't ready to let go of the tiny black-footed cat just yet. "I knew she was a fighter," George said quietly, a soft smile creeping onto his face. "She found her way to me for a reason. I won't let her down." As Dr. Stone continued her work, George stayed by Storm's side, his presence a constant source of comfort for the tiny creature. The storm had passed, but now it was a fight for survival against a different kind of threat. The next few days were a blur of medical care, late-night vigils, and cautious optimism. Storm's condition improved slowly but steadily. Dr. Stone had called in an expert on small predators to help with Storm's specific needs, and the knowledge shared made a difference. Storm was finally able to eat small portions of specially prepared food, though her appetite was weak. Still, it was a sign that her body was slowly rebuilding the strength it had lost. George never left her side. Each morning, he would sit beside her cage, his presence a silent promise. He'd been through this before, rescuing animals in desperate need of help, but this time felt different. The connection he had with this tiny black-footed cat was undeniable. He had become her lifeline, and she had become his. By the end of the week, Storm was strong enough to be moved into a larger enclosure at the clinic, and she began exploring her surroundings, though her movements were still tentative. George visited her daily, watching her grow more confident with each passing day. The bond between them deepened, and Storm seemed to recognize him, her eyes following him as he moved about the room, her tiny form pressing against the bars when he came near. One afternoon, as George sat watching her chase a small toy across the room, he felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Dr. Stone, her expression more serious than usual. "George," she said softly, "I think it's time." George's heart skipped a beat. Time for what? It's time for her to return to the wild. She's strong enough now. She'll never truly be the same as she was before the storm, but she has a chance. George swallowed hard. The thought of letting her go after everything they had been through made his chest tighten, but he knew it was the right thing to do. With a bittersweet feeling, George agreed. He helped prepare Storm for a release, packing her into a small transport crate for the journey back to the wilderness. The storm had brought her to him, but now it was time to return her to where she belonged. The drive back to the reserve was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the truck's engine and the gentle rustling of Storm's crate in the back. George's heart felt heavy, but there was also a sense of peace in knowing that Storm was going back to her home, where she belonged. As they reached the edge of the reserve, George stopped the truck and carefully lifted the crate from the back. The trees stood tall and unyielding, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, as though welcoming Storm back. The scent of the forest filled the air, rich with earth and life. With a final glance at the small cat, George slowly opened the crate. Storm hesitated at first, her tiny form barely visible against the towering grass. But then, with a cautious step, she darted out of the crate and into the wild. For a long moment, George watched as she disappeared into the underbrush, her small figure swallowed by the vastness of the forest. He stood still, a lump in his throat, knowing that he had made the right decision. She had survived. And now, Storm was free. For the first time in a long while, George smiled. His work wasn't over, and there would always be more animals to rescue, but this was a moment to remember. Storm had come to him in the storm, and with his care and dedication, she had found her way back to the wild. And so, the old man returned to his cabin, knowing that his work would continue, but with a small part of his heart forever belonging to the tiny black-footed cat that had stolen it. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.